It is commonly known that many of our nation's early citizens had fled Europe and journeyed to the colonies to find religious freedom. But what role did the local church play in the founding of our nation? Did church pastors and ministers engage in the battlefield and the political arenas of their day? Or were they, as modern society now enforces, relegated to serving only religious matters within the four walls of the church? Discover the forgotten and astonishing story of our nation's foundation in the American Heritage series. For centuries, Americans were taught a truthful view of history that recognized the godly heroes and moral foundation our nation was founded upon. But in recent years, a new version of history has assaulted the moral and spiritual fiber of our nation, leaving the truth of our past eliminated and forgotten until today. Join historian David Barton and experience the untold story of our nation's history in the American Heritage series. During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
One particular body or profession of individuals that may have had as much impact as any other group in America in securing American independence was pastors. Not only had they talked about all these issues from the pulpit, but when it came time to actually go on the battlefield and fight, they were at the forefront of congregations.
Wow.
Pastors were
clergy.
right out front. I'll give you a great example. We all learn in school about the story of Paul Revere writing to let them know the British are coming.
Right.
There's a lot more to that story than we hear. I mean, in several ways, not only on the pastor side, but also writing that same night with Paul Revere was an African-American patriot named Wentworth Cheswell. Now, it turns out that Revere is headed to the west to let them know the British are coming. Wentworth Cheswell went north to let them know the British are coming, but the two took off. And we hear about Revere because the British actually did go west and not north. Well, where is it that Revere is writing to let the Americans know that the British are coming? He's writing in the home of one man, the Reverend Jonas Clark. That's where he's headed, one place. Why Clark's home? Well, he was in Lexington. The British were going to Lexington to take the stores there and take the ammunition, the stores of supplies they had. So he's writing to let Reverend Clark know. Oh, why not let the mayor know or something? No, he's writing to let Reverend Clark know. Why Reverend Clark? Because that night, John Hancock and Sam Adams were staying with Reverend Clark, which they did all the time. The Reverend Clark was the most significant political leader in that community. As a matter of fact, he's the one who helped write the resolutions for Massachusetts to separate from Great Britain, become part of the United States of America. He's the guy that was sent to help write the state constitution for Massachusetts. Here's a preacher involved in all this. So here comes Paul Revere. They finally get word, and when word arrives for Sam Adams and John Hancock that the British are coming, those two turned to Reverend Jonas Clark and looked at him and said, "Pastor, are your people ready?"
Wow.
And he says, "I've trained them for just this very moment." So when the call went out, the alarm bell rang that the British were coming. And by the way, the alarm bell that rang was the bell in his church that rang to let him know the British were coming. 150 people gathered there to meet the British. They gathered at his church, led by him, and they were out of his church. It was his church that gathered to fight the British. Well, it turned out the British didn't come on the first alarm. So the second alarm sounds, and they regather, and there's Jonas Clark at the church. And so they go out on the green to fight the British, and he made real clear that, listen, God blesses a defensive war. He doesn't bless an offensive war, so don't you fire the first shot. Wow. And that was real simple. If they fire at us, let them have it, but don't you fire the first shot. And so when that first shot was fired, by the time the volley was over, the shot heard around the world, by the time it's all over, what you have is 18 Americans laying there on Lexington Green. 8 of them were dead, 10 of them were wounded. All of them were out of his church. And so here, Paul Revere is writing to find this preacher, because that's where the patriot leaders are, is with this preacher. And when it comes time to fight, it's the preacher that gets the church to go out there and defend their rights. Well, as the British start moving from Lexington back to Boston, along the way, they find the closer they get to Boston, the more opposition they find. It wasn't just fighting 100 Americans out at Lexington. By the time they get back to Boston, there's several thousand Americans lining the road, sniping at them from both sides with rifles. Where'd those guys come from? Wentworth Cheswell, the patriot, strong Christian, black American who went north to warn them, let them know the British are coming, so they got together and came south to meet the British. So as the British are coming back along the road to Boston, he's put out the alarm and all these guys are gathered along, and it's amazing how many of the groups along the road were pastors who went and grabbed their own rifle, assembled their church, and took their men to meet the British as they were coming back. So Jonas Clark is one example. By the way, this is the sermon that he preached the very next year after Lexington. This is Pastor Clark. This is a very famous sermon that he delivered and gave. And this particular sermon is recounting the one-year anniversary of what the British did to start the American Revolution. It's his congregation, his folks. And I tell you, his eyewitness account is pretty remarkable on what happened. Who are the leaders most responsible for the movement in America that led to our independence? Today we hear names like Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration, John Hancock, the President of Congress with his bold signature on the Declaration, and John Adams, who not only signed the Declaration but who also negotiated and signed the peace treaty with Great Britain to secure our independence. These are indeed important political leaders behind our independence, but in previous generations we also knew about other important leaders. In fact, John Adams himself declared that the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Mayhew and the Reverend Dr. Samuel Cooper were two of the individuals, quote, most conspicuous, the most ardent and influential in the, quote, awakening and revival of American principles and feelings that led to our independence. Other ministers whose influence and leadership was also important included the Reverend George Whitefield, the Reverend James Caldwell, the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, and his brother, the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, and many more. By the way, the exploits of many of these ministers are recorded in several older historical works, including The Pulpit of the American Revolution from 1860, The Patriot Preachers of the American Revolution, also from 1860, and The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution from 1861. Yet today, we don't hear much about the role of the church, of ministers and Christians, in the founding of our civil government. So on what basis could John Adams say that pastors in particular and Christians in general were so influential in our move for independence? Because of the work of pastors in shaping the worldview of the nation and because of the work of Christians in founding our government. One of the chief advocators of American independence was the Reverend George Whitefield. Now, we might have heard about Reverend Whitefield from the First Great Awakening, but we weren't told that George Whitefield is the guy who was urging Americans to separate from Great Britain. He said Great Britain is trying to force an established church on you. They're trying to take your liberties away, both civil and religious. Unless you separate, you won't preserve your liberties. We don't consider that to be part of revival preaching. It was part of the American Great Awakening revival. So Whitefield had such a substantial impact that not only did he go to Parliament to argue for the Americans when they did the Stamp Act in 1765, but he did so many things militarily wise to help the Americans get ready for it that when it came time, he died in 1770. He's buried in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And back then when they buried individuals, they often buried them inside the church. And in the case of very prominent ministers, they would kind of make a sarcophagus for them and put them perhaps down in the basement. A lot of other famous individuals they literally buried in the aisles of the church. So they took and buried Whitefield down in the basement of the church. As the first troops are getting ready to leave from Massachusetts to go up and to try to engage the British as they're in Canada, up toward Quebec, etc., as they're getting ready to leave Newburyport to go to that battle in Canada, they stopped by the church where Whitefield was buried. They had a sermon preached there to the entire military before they left. And then the leader of the military, followed by all the guys, went downstairs. They lifted the top off that sarcophagus where Whitefield is buried. Now this is 5-6 years after he's dead, so he's quite decayed. They reached inside that casket and started cutting pieces off his robe to take with them into battle because he was their inspirational leader for American independence. They wanted to take this remembrance of the hero and what their hero had done and told them into battle.
During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, The local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
This is a small house rotunda. It joins the main Capitol rotunda with the old house chambers. In this room are 3 statues, including this one, of the Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. In the 1770s, Reverend Muhlenberg pastored 2 churches in the tiny town of Woodstock, Virginia, on the west side of the Blue Ridge Mountains. One of those churches was an English-speaking Episcopal church, and the other was a German-speaking Lutheran church. In addition to pastoring these 2 churches, Reverend Muhlenberg was also a member of the Virginia legislature. In mid-January of 1776, Pastor Muhlenberg returned from the state legislature in Williamsburg to his churches in Woodstock. Even though the Declaration of Independence had not yet been signed, armed conflict was fully underway. In fact, British troops were already at work in Virginia. They marched on Williamsburg, seizing the Patriots' gunpowder and munitions. Patrick Henry quickly rallied 5,000 Virginians to retake those munitions or to demand full repayment by the British for what they had seized. With the state on the brink of war, on January the 21st, 1776, Reverend Muhlenberg stood in his pulpit and delivered what was to become his farewell sermon.
Let me read from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time for war, and a time for peace. In the language of Holy Writ, there is a time for all things, a time to pray, a time to preach, but a new time has come. There is a time to fight, and that time is now. If we fail to stand against the oppressor, if we don't rise up to protect ourselves and our precious liberties, we will lose them to the tyrant, for none else will take up this cause for us. We must make the sacrifice. We must bear up in arms in the fight. So I call you now to stand with me in this cause, most urgent and noble.
Outside the church, Pastor Muhlenberg ordered drummers to beat for recruits, and some 300 men from his congregations joined him that day. They became known as the 8th Virginia Regiment. The Reverend John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg went on to become one of America's highest-ranking military officers. He finished with the rank of Major General, one of only 17 officers in the American Revolution to achieve that rank. And you'll find him in the picture in the rotunda of the surrender of the British at Yorktown. This statue, depicting the moment in which Pastor Muhlenberg removed his clerical robes to reveal his military uniform to his congregation, reflects yet another aspect of America's rich spiritual heritage depicted so widely throughout the Capitol building. Interestingly, John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg had a brother, and his brother was also a minister. And he's also featured in a prominent location here in the Capitol. John Peter's brother was the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, pastor of a church in New York City. Frederick had at first been critical of his brother becoming involved as a minister in defense of liberty. But when the British arrived in New York City in 1777, they drove Frederick from his own church and then desecrated the building. Frederick thus found himself rethinking his position, and he too made the decision to get involved. You can find his portrait hanging directly behind the current House chambers in what is called the Speaker's Lobby. It is a room filled with portraits of all the previous speakers of the House. Why is a portrait of the Reverend Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg prominently displayed there? Because he was the original Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. In fact, his signature is one of only 2 on the Bill of Rights. Another remarkable contribution to American liberty by yet another minister of the gospel. You'll find that one of the great military leaders in New Jersey was the Reverend James Caldwell. He was a Presbyterian pastor. And at the early stages of the American Revolution, we had a lot of will, but we didn't have a lot of means. I mean, we did not have much in the way of equipment, ammunition, supplies. We didn't have much in the way of money. You'll find that a lot of the soldiers in the first early years of the American Revolution went for 3 years without being paid anything. We couldn't afford it. So it's really a bunch of farmers and business owners and ship owners taking their own private resources best they can to go fight the world's greatest military power. Well, during one of the battles, as they were fighting the British, it was a battle outside a church, the Americans ran out of wadding for their guns. Now, if you don't have that wadding to hold the powder in there and separate it from the lead, it's not worth having the lead, not worth having the powder. So they ran out of wadding. He gets this brainy idea. He runs inside the church and grabs the hymn books and brings the hymn books out. And the hymn books were Watts' hymnal. Watts' hymnal done by Isaac Watts, one of the greatest Christian theologians in history. So he brings that out and he gets this kind of thought and he says, we can deliver a message to the British twofold here. So he tears out these pages. He said, let's give them Watts, boys. It's like, let's deliver some pure doctrine to the British here. So they used the hymn books for the wadding in there. And that's a very famous painting of the American Revolution called Give 'em Watts by this preacher. Well, obviously the British want to take him out. And they tried to assassinate him one night, shot through the window on his house and actually ended up killing his wife. The bullet deflected, shot his wife. And that just dug his heels in even further. So he would fight during the week and on Sundays would preach at his church on Sunday. And on Sundays, he pulled out a really big Bible, big pulpit Bible. And on Sundays, he would lay 2 braces of pistols up on top of that Bible. And he would challenge anybody to take his guns or take his Bible away from him. I mean, he was just not going to be intimidated.
Wow.
And that was the character and the caliber of so many of those leaders. George Washington, in his famous farewell address of 1796, reminded us why our government and its policies were so successful. He declared,
"Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports."
Yet many today, including many Christians, have fallen into believing that Christians should not be involved in civil government, that there should be some sort of a compartmentalization, that our faith should be kept in one arena and real life in another, and that the two should never meet. The Bible does not teach that, and fortunately, our founding fathers and early ministers did not believe that. Yet many critics today try to invoke what Jesus said in Matthew 22 as proof that Christians should not be involved. But this is a complete mischaracterization of that passage. Matthew 22:21 says that we are to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But do you remember why Jesus said this? He was asked whether it was right to pay taxes. Jesus picked up a coin, asked whose inscription was on it, and when they said Caesar's, Jesus replied, "Then render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." That is, render your due to the government and render your due to God. You have responsibilities in both areas. By the way, here in America, who is Caesar? Our Constitution says that Caesar is we the people. So are we saying that God should not be involved with Caesar, with we the people? That makes no sense. Jesus affirmed that we have responsibilities in both arenas because of our dual citizenship. We are citizens of heaven, but we're also citizens of earth, and we have duties in both arenas. But beyond the passage in Matthew 22, there are many other biblical passages where God endorses the involvement of His people in the civil arena, an institution that He Himself created and ordained. For example, notice that in Romans 13, verses 4 through 6, on 3 separate occasions, the Scripture says that those who are in civil government are, quote, ministers of God. Perhaps this is why so many ministers were involved in the civil arena during the founding era. They believed and obeyed the Bible. Consider also Hebrews 11. This is our Faith Hall of Fame. This is where the great heroes of our faith are held up to us as our examples. And we're told in Hebrews 12 that it is these heroes who are cheering us on. Yet notice that every one of the heroes of our faith listed in Hebrews 11, verses 22 through 34, was involved in civil government. Why would God hold them up to us as examples to emulate if He didn't believe it was right for His people to be involved in the civil arena?
During the Revolutionary War of the 1700s, the local church, pastors, and clergymen played a pivotal role in the founding of our nation. But how did the church respond to such lingering issues as slavery and civil rights? Is there still a role for churches and pastors to play in today's political arena? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
And what we're talking about today is the role of pastors that really led up to the Revolutionary War and what their part would play.
Tell you, these pastors we had in the American Revolution were men.
Yes.
In the West, we would say they were men with a bark on. You know, they wore out their clothes from the inside out. You know, so they were rough. They were rugged individuals. They knew the Bible. They were committed to principle.
Yes.
They were not vicious in any sense. And that's why Pastor Clark was so emphatic that you have to do this a biblical way. Don't you fire the first shot. But if they fire at you, the Bible gives you every right of self-defense, and you can go after them. One of the great examples I love of a man of God, you know, we use that term, man of God. It was a man of God, was the Reverend John Wise out of Ipswich, Massachusetts. Now, he was an intellectual thinker, one of the greatest intellectual forces in early colonial America. He's the guy that from his pulpit, he already taught from his pulpit that taxation without representation is tyranny, the consent of the governed, all these things in the Declaration he taught. But he was no small, wimpy, namby-pamby kind of a guy. He was a large physical specimen. He was a great wrestler as well. And as he was growing old, his years were passing by, a young man named John Chandler from a neighboring town decided he wanted to wrestle Pastor Wise, take him on a wrestling match. So he went to Ipswich. John Chandler came from Andover over to Ipswich, challenged Pastor Wise to a wrestling match. And Wise said, I'm too old, man, I'm sick, my hair's gray, I can't do this. And he kept pushing him and so on. Okay, I'll take you on. So, I mean, just moments after this wrestling match started, Pastor Wise picked him up bodily and threw him over the front fence. And so this young ship captain thinks he's tough. He stands up, he brushes himself off, he gets his dignity, regains his full height. He said, Pastor Wise, you defeated me. I'll be on my way just as soon as you throw my horse over the fence after me. It was a concession. This is a strong physical guy. Reverend Wise, in the same way, there was a time when some members of his congregation were captured by pirates there in Massachusetts. And as he led the prayers that Sunday, he prayed that God would bring them deliverance, or that his men would rise up and butcher the enemies who had captured them. The next day, the men rose up and butchered all the pirates who captured them. Whole town's convinced God answers his prayer. You know? But those aren't likely to be the prayers we would pray today. Those aren't the images we have of preachers, of pastors. But these were men of God in every sense. Preachers were so important, pastors were so important in the American Revolution that they were recognized by their opponents. The British called them the Black Regiment because ministers wore black robes. And these guys wearing the black robes, that was the Black Regiment, and that was the one that was creating all the trouble. It was these guys that were recruiting men to go fight. It was these guys that were leading the battles. This Black Regiment, all these preachers in these black robes out fighting the battles, that was the real trouble for the British. And the British accused the preachers of stirring up the sedition and rousing the coals of sedition. I mean, they blamed the preachers for the American Revolution.
Wow.
So when the British caught a preacher as a prisoner of war, they were treated more roughly than were the American soldiers that were caught as prisoner of war. And in the American Revolution, we lost over 10,000 more soldiers to British prisoner of war camps than we did to British bullets. So prisoner of war camps are rough anyway, but for a preacher it was rougher than it was for a soldier. That's the recognition that the British had of the leadership of preachers in the American Revolution. Consider 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2. In this passage, we are told to pray, quote, first of all, for all people, for our leaders and those in authority. Notice, God tells us to pray for our civil leaders first of all, before we pray for ourselves, our families, or our churches. There's nothing else in the Bible that God tells us to pray for first of all. This must mean that God thinks that civil government is important. And recall the parable of the minas in Luke 19. The master calls the servants together and gives them all a mina, a trust, a stewardship. The master departs and then later returns to take account of their stewardship. One had taken the mina and turned it into 10. Another had turned his into 5, and another had taken his trust and not used it at all. The one who refused to get involved with what the master had entrusted him was the one who got in trouble. But notice the reward for the other two. To the one, the master said, well done, good and faithful servant. I will make you a ruler over 10 cities. To the other he said, well done. I will make you a ruler over 5 cities. Notice the reward of the master for their faithful stewardship. He places them into civil government. Today, we don't think of being in civil government as a reward from the master, but maybe it's time to rethink our beliefs about civil government based on what the Bible says. You know, pastors really were leaders in the American Revolution, and they were leaders not only off the battlefield, but also on it. But they were community leaders, and they weren't leaders just by their position, their title. They literally earned that position of leadership. They demonstrated either through courage or through conviction or through their preaching, their knowledge of the Word, that they were worthy of that leadership. And I find it really significant that as you go into the American Revolution, the Continental Congress is operating, they're trying to conduct the war and the revolution, you have so many ministers out on the battlefield fighting, that in 1778 is a great example. On May the 8th of 1778, Congress wanted the nation to know the update on the war. So Congress says, here's what's happened at this point. We've been at conflict now for several years. Here's where we are, and here's where we think the future leads. Here's what we think is happening. And so Congress went through and talked about what the British had been doing, all the slaughters, all the terrible things that had happened, how that they have now incited the Indians to turn loose on us, and so in addition to fighting the British, we're fighting the Indians. So all this is going on, and then Congress writes a summary that says, but the God of heaven has been our aid and our assistance in all this, and the prospects are bright because reliance on Him, we're convinced that He, and so it was a great spiritual peace, and you'll find that throughout Congress, the writings and the proclamations they did. But this particular one is so substantial because they wanted the people to have the update on the war. So at the end of it, what they did was they put a resolution asking every minister of the gospel to take that congressional document and read it Sunday morning after services were over. Anybody wants to stay around? You look, they want the word out in America, but they did not say, let's print it in the newspapers. They did not say, let's put this on the public posting boards and put broadsides up. They did not put it with town criers. They said, we need the preachers to read this out of the pulpit so that America knows what's going on. The preachers had more impact, literally, this is documented, preachers had more impact at getting out the news than did the newspapers. The greatest source of getting out the news was preachers. Congress even went to the preachers when they needed something distributed across the nation. And literally, there's a very substantial chance that without their leadership, that we would not have the independence we have today had it not been for pastors taking the lead role in so many areas of American life and culture.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundations and encourages us to once again view history through a truthful lens. For only when we recognize and embrace God's hand in our history can America become all that it was intended to be. Through Wall Builders, historian David Barton seeks to rebuild the walls of America's unique religious, moral, and constitutional heritage by educating the public and encouraging people of faith to become active in strengthening America's great foundations. For more information on how you can become involved, visit wallbuilders.com.